It's nice to see you. Thank you for coming this evening. In case you don't know me, my name is Eva Atanasov, and I'm a scholar and student of political thought and other related matters. And it's my great privilege today to be introducing our distinguished speaker. This is also the first, let me say that this lecture tonight is the first of a series of lectures on popular sovereignty, which is co-organized and co-hosted by Bard College Berlin, together with Humboldt-University's Law and Society Institute, with the generous support of the American Social Science Research Council. So the series is part of a larger project launched by the Council to promote a more robust relationship or sort of cross-pollination between humanistic and empirical approaches in the social sciences, so kind of methodological program, and foster a kind of inquiry, scholarly inquiry that seeks to not only ascertain empirical reality or facts, but also raise questions about meaning and values. And so it is only just and also very fortunate that we can open this series with a lecture by Geoffrey Harpham, who's an eminent scholar in the humanities. Before I say a little more about Geoffrey, I wanted to maybe make a short plug for two of our next events. So you can mark your calendars on October 31st at 6 p.m. David Deisenhouse, who's on the Faculty of Law of the University of Toronto, will talk to us about Brexit and the legal idea of sovereignty. And on November 20th, again at 6 p.m., Ivan Krastev, who is at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna, will try to make sense of the long 1989. Both of these events are taking place at Humboldt-University in the law faculty, and there will be more information soon. Okay, so Geoffrey Harpham is a senior fellow at the Kent Institute of Ethics at Duke. He has been for a long time, before that, a director of the National Humanities Center. It's one of the world's most distinguished or leading institutes for advanced studies that promotes, has taken upon itself to support humanistic scholarship and the role of humanities in modern society in an American life. Geoffrey is also an acclaimed scholar himself, with an author of over 100 articles and 10 books. I want to give a very brief illustration of the range or the kind of topics he's been written. So his first book, which became a classic, I believe still in print, is that right? Is called On the Grotesque, Strategies of Contradiction in Art and Literature. He's coming out of Princeton, and then his latest two books, The Humanities and the Dream of America, and What Do You Think, Mr. Ramirez, The American Revolution in Education, both of them out of Chicago, are in a way, I believe, a kind of embodiment of the mission of the National Humanities Center, to think through the role of humanities in society and of humanistic teaching. And his new book, which he presented today at lunch, Scholarship and Freedom, sort of examines the synergies between and the task, the practices, and the ethos of scholarship and liberal democratic society. And if I might add a little bit of a personal touch, it seems to me it's also a very courageous kind of inquiry, a coming to grips of a scholar with the meaning and purpose of his own life. And so, speaking of courage, Geoffrey will present today his new project, which deals with a very notorious film. Some of us suffered through it last night. Well, suffered might not be the right word, but anyway. So he'll talk about The Nation in the Birth of a Nation, of D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. Right after Geoffrey's talk, we'll have a brief response by Aaron Tugendhaft, so let me also briefly present Aaron and thank him for taking on that task. Aaron is a scholar of ancient Middle East, and as he says, as his website says it, a dedicated humanities teacher focusing on religion, political philosophy, and the arts. I think it's all true. He received his PhD from the Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at the New York University, and also holds degrees in art history and social thought from the University of Chicago. He is the author of Baal and the Politics of Poetry from last year, and his new book, which is coming next year, I believe, is called The Idols of Isis, and it explores the role of images in politics from ancient Assyria to the internet today. So please join me in welcoming Geoffrey Harpham and his response.
Thank you, Eva, and I do apologize for putting you through the birth of a nation last night. You described it as suffering, but then you said, but maybe not suffering. But the look she gave me at the end of the movie was unmistakable. You put me through this. All I did was think that you had put me through an overnight flight. I put you through Birth of a Nation, so we should be even on this. I'm going to talk today about the nation and the birth of a nation, which is not the customary approach to this film at all. But the customary approaches seemed to me so sterile and unproductive that I thought that a film of this stature, both in the history of the medium and in the history of the country, should be available for present tense discussion. And so some way of reconceiving the film in a way that would kind of run by the nets of moral approbation was really necessary. There are two things that people must say about the film, and they don't stand in easy relationship to each other. The first is that it's the most important event in the history of cinema as a medium. That is, it's the one that most dramatically, abruptly, unpredictably, and effectively advanced the technique of cinema, more than any other film, and there's no serious competition. People talk about Citizen Kane, and I respect the innovation with the angles and the storytelling and everything like this, but in terms of developing the medium, there's nothing close. Most films before that had been one-reel Nickelodeon entertainments, and you paid a nickel for them, and they were considered low entertainment. This film is a 3-hour and 8 or 9 minute extravaganza that tells the birth of the nation, a vast, ambitious theme, and it tells a narrative, an extraordinarily complicated narrative, which had not been the way that movies had proceeded. As I said, they were basically entertainments. Along the way, all sorts of things about close-ups, long shots, moving cameras, intercutting where you have things happening and then simultaneously things happening over here, and they're mixed together, are developed to a degree that must have been alarming. The scene of the Ku Klux Klan riders riding at you was so terrifying that at the first showings, people would actually back up out of their seats because the illusion was so powerful. And Griffith really invented cinema as a serious message-bearing storytelling medium. In the course of doing so, he invented the notion of the director. When the movie first came out, it was called The Klansman, after the name of the novel that it was based on. And the author was Thomas Dixon, who was the author of that novel. But eventually, it became The Birth of a Nation, and D.W. Griffith, the director. Who's that? Who even knew what the director was? The director came front and center, and cinematic history has been set. So there's that. Extraordinary prominence in the history of the medium, and nobody can dispute that. The second thing that people must say about it is that it's the most morally reprehensible, shameful artifact, major artifact that's ever been produced in the United States. It's a film that the viewing of it is painful. But why it's painful, that is the issue. That it's painful, very few people would disagree with, unless you're a hardcore, devotee of Klan violence and racial hatred. But why it's painful, that's something else. And what's interesting is that neither of these two positions, that it's morally shameful and that it's technologically unbelievably great, is controversial in the least degree. It's controversial in the least degree. So how do you fit these together? The story is very compellingly told. It's beautiful, it's evocative, it's sensitive, and at the same time, it's just hateful. How you fit these together is something of the question. I think that from the first, there has been resistance to seeing the movie at all. Resistance by African Americans and by white liberals to seeing the movie at all. The standard critical response has not been to take some line of argument against the movie, but rather to insist that it should not be shown, that it should be destroyed, that it should be banned, that nobody should ever see this. And I kind of wonder why this is. You know, it's unlikely that people would be converted to racial violence on seeing a 104-year-old film. So what is being accomplished by suppressing the film? I'm not sure, but that's a question that I'll address kind of indirectly. I think that we can only really advance what seems to me a kind of paralyzed discussion that focuses on banning or suppressing if we reconceive the film as being about something other than what it seems to be about. And The Nation is my candidate for that something other. If we can suspend the idea that the film endorses race hatred in a way that nobody would really find acceptable except the violent lunatic fringe, and see that the film is actually productively about something else, then we can perhaps understand the film as being, a major artifact in some other way than the morally disgraceful. And I think in order to do this, you have to detach the film from its co-creators, Thomas Dixon, the author of this novel, and D.W. Griffith, the director of the film. These are compromised and questionable figures in two different ways. Dixon made it his job to be the nation's leading racist, and was quite effective and eminent and unapologetic about this. But his racism is not the solely evil kind that we like to think. He didn't hate or want to kill black people. He just wanted them out of here. He didn't want to see them. He thought they were inferior. He thought they were degenerate. He thought they were uneducable. You could never do anything with them, and the nation would be much better off without them. And he placed himself in the tradition of Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln in this respect, both of whom entertained thoughts like this. And before he became the nation's leading racist, Dixon was the nation's leading public speaker on behalf of social justice and social welfare. He thought that the poorest should be helped, the least fortunate should be assisted, and he wrote many books. He had the nation's largest congregation in Manhattan, speaking a doctrine of social welfare and social justice. And then, towards the end of the 19th century, he flipped and became the nation's leading racist, without, in his mind, making much of a transformation at all. This is a deep mystery. And all I want to do by suggesting this is to say that Dixon is a more complicated figure than we might be expected just based on this evidence. He was a supporter of Theodore Roosevelt. He considered himself a friend to the Jews, and by then contemporary standards, he was very philo-Semitic. He's just a complicated figure, not, I would say, an admirable figure in very many respects, not a talented writer in literary standards, but he was a complex figure. And there's Griffith, also a Southerner like Dixon, son of a Confederate soldier who loved to tell war stories about his heroic exploits, but basically not a thinker at all. He was an artist in this undeveloped medium of film. He didn't take social ideas very seriously. He made about 500 films, never considered any of them his personal expression. He was a filmmaker. He was heavily invested in sentimental, generic modes like melodrama. War was a good subject for him, both because he was a Southerner and because it provided the opportunity for spectacle. He was a filmmaker, and to look to him as the source of racial hatred and evil is to kind of run into a dry well, because his thinking, it seems to me, just didn't run that deeply. And his biographers have had recourse to notions of unconscious or passive racism or just kind of unwitting conventional thinking, but nobody discovers any evil in him. And so if we're looking to the film as an expression of evil attitudes, both of the men primarily behind it don't provide us the kind of handle that we would like for that. So I'm not going to deny that race is a primary subject and in fact an inescapable subject, but I will try to work you around to a way of seeing the film as something other than a testament to racial hatred. So, what it is, I would say, is an endorsement of white supremacy, which is, this is uncomfortable to say, but it's different from racial hatred. Hatred endorses violence against black people. White supremacy cast itself at the time as a kind of pragmatic approach to nation building. After the emancipation of the slaves and the end of the Civil War, the task at the time seemed to many people not to find a path to full equality, but to find a path to white supremacy that was nonviolent. And some people, like Dixon, were saying you should still ship them all to the Caribbean or to Africa, but other people were trying to find other ways of containing what Griffith calls the disunion represented by black people. And this movie is very much in that line of thinking. People who attack the movie as being a testament to racial hatred generally say that it's wildly unrealistic in its depiction of black people, which I will not contest and could not conceive contesting. But they presume that unreality or irrealism or a failure of realism represents a kind of moral failure as well. And I'm going to take a different approach to that. We'll start off with a depiction, and if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. If you've not, I'll try to represent it. There's a depiction in the film of the South Carolina legislature in 1871. And at that time, the South Carolina legislature was the only one in the country that had a black majority, courtesy of Reconstruction. Blacks had the franchise, they could run for office. They actually had more black people in the state than white people in South Carolina. And there was some suppression of the white vote, and they had a black majority. And there's a long scene depicting the behavior of the black majority in South Carolina in 1871. And they're acting like idiots. They're drinking, they're talking with each other, they're leering at white women in the gallery, they're taking their shoes off, they're not taking their governance responsibilities very seriously. And in the novel, this is called a minstrel farce, just an absolute degradation of the idea of democratic governance. And so I wanted to think about this. It clearly doesn't look like a serious deliberating body. But what were these people? And so I looked up and I found in the historian Eric Foner determination gone into the 239 people in the South Carolina legislature and discovered that almost 2/3 of them were ex-slaves. And I thought, well, what would an ex-slave in 1871 be like? You know, would he be behaving like Daniel Webster? He probably would have been literate only within the last 5 years. What were slaves treated like, that they would be able to go from slavery to the legislature in just a couple of years? The treatment of slaves was incredibly brutal. They were discouraged from learning. They were discouraged from any kind of aspiration. They were discouraged from, they couldn't wear certain clothes, they couldn't travel, they couldn't do anything. They were in chattel slavery, your property. And to see people 6 years later in the legislature is, you cannot be surprised if not all of them comported themselves like statesmen in the tradition of Jefferson and Hamilton and Madison. You could say that in their loudishness and boorishness, they're not behaving like black people do naturally. They're behaving like white people actually did. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence for this, and I'll work on this. You could actually describe their behavior as represented in the movie, not as natural black behavior, what is that? But as the kind of durable stamp of chattel slavery on a human being, which is profound. And the fact that they were able to actually perform governmental responsibilities is deeply impressive. This becomes even more impressive when you consider what the actual 1871 South Carolina legislature did. It was heroic. They instituted public education that was non-discriminating. They made the state university in South Carolina admit black people. They had universal suffrage. Many of these things were then rolled back, at the end of Reconstruction. They provided social welfare programs. They eliminated medieval punishments that were still part of the state codes. That 1871 legislature, shoes on, shoes off, these were heroes, no matter what they behaved like. And in the first slide, here we go. Here is a movie of the Union League, a meeting of the Union League that shows white carpetbaggers there in the top hats talking to these largely indifferent people about what Griffith and Dixon clearly considered lunatic measures. There's the 40 acres and a mule, but then equality, equal rights, equal politics, and most tellingly, equal marriage. Now this is presented as a radical program that only a wild-eyed radical would endorse. And the list in the book, The Klansman, is actually somewhat longer and more specific, and I'll read it. This is what the legislature was considering: a measure to disarm the whites and equip Negro militia with rifles, to prevent any person calling another a nigger, force whites and blacks to attend the same schools, open the state university to Negroes, permit intermarriage, and enforce social equality. Now Dixon clearly thought that this was just crazy. But if you look down that list, you see a progressive, rational, fair, humane list of initiatives, not all of which we have achieved today. This would still be a progressive, rational, fair list. And showing this in this movie, Griffith actually represents what to a contemporary audience would be admirable behavior by the black legislatures. And by showing it as ridiculous and contemptible even, he actually shows white resistance to it in a light that we would consider disgraceful. So the message at one level might be a deeply racist message, but if you see it at another level, it's possible to see it as as a complex representation that honors the contribution of black people and denigrates white resistance in very unvarnished terms. So what the film shows is both factual and not what either of its creators might have intended. You see, if you detach the movie from the intentions of its creators, you can get a more complex understanding of its message. The most egregious of these messages concerns marriage equality, and this was the great fear. This was the fear that dominated others, because intermarriage, miscegenation, racial mixing was the move that led directly to the mongrelizing of the races and social collapse. This is the end of it all. This is game over if you permit racial equality or marriage equality. Now, in the book, there is a scene in which a black man actually rapes a white woman. Griffith, for whatever reason, did not include this. He could have, and in other of his movies he did. But he did not transcribe the black rapist into his movie. He has a former family servant of a family named Gus propose to the daughter of the family and says, I'm captain in the army now and I'd like to get married, and would you marry me? And at this, there we go. This is the proposal moment here. And at this, where are we here? I'm afraid these are not in the order that and now I've lost it altogether. Okay, I don't see one that I had. Must not have made it through. But after he proposes, there we go. She goes nuts. She loses her mind. She flings her arms around. She runs through the woods screaming. He follows after her, saying, "I didn't mean anything. I'm not going to hurt you." She runs up a mountainside and throws herself off the cliff in order to avoid what? The shame of it all. The whole scene seems to be constructed as a stimulus to what Dixon described as a feeling of abhorrence in white people, especially white women, against colored men, which was very much what Dixon thought was necessary. If white women were receptive to the advances of colored men, that's the collapse of civilization. So this whole scene seems designed to do that. But audiences, every audience, would definitely know that miscegenation was not the work of black men, it was the work of white men. And that every mulatto that was seen was evidence of a white rape of a black woman. There was testimony taken after the Klan arose in 1871, thousands of pages of congressional testimony that turned up not one case of a rape of a white woman by a black man, hundreds of cases of white predation on blacks, none of them punished. So what the film shows, and everybody would have known this, was not a realistic depiction. It was kind of a projection. It was a kind of compost of white fears, white desires, white panic. And so what's represented was what was not real, and what was not represented, which is the reverse. White predation on black women was not being represented at all. So that the representation, in a sense, actually displays its own dishonesty, if you can see that. Everybody would have known that this is not the way things went down. The unreality effect here. Let's see if the next one is greatly compounded by the use of blackface. And this is one of the most discomforting things about this movie. It's one of the most striking things. If you saw it last night, many actors are in blackface, although not all. There are black actors, but none of the people who have roles of any kind are in blackface. And this is thought to be, well, it is a kind of holdover from a minstrel show tradition, where you'd have singing and dancing by people dressing up to be black. The film Showboat actually features this. Blackface was an American tradition. There's a film with Fred Astaire and Judy Garland in blackface. It was just widespread. Today it's considered almost unwatchable, horrible, and as a sign of racism. The critic Andrew Saris actually said that Griffith considered blackness to be such an unworthy condition that blacks couldn't even be entrusted with representing it. That had to be allocated to whites. But I would suggest another way of looking at blackface. As you see, Gus, the actor Walter Long, made no attempt to look like a black man at all. He just kind of put on quirk, but there's nothing else. And the other blackface actors, they all look absolutely like white people with artificially darkened skin. What I'm suggesting is that this representation draws attention to its own artifice in almost Brechtian fashion. It lays bare the mechanism of its own irrealism. There's no attempt made here to render an actual black actor. And if I add that to the fact that Griffith declined to have the act involved be a rape, but rather a failed marriage proposal, you see something more complicated going on. As we were walking over, Aaron told me that if you ask any person who has not seen The Birth of a Nation what happens in it, they'd say there's a rape of a white woman by a black man. That actually doesn't happen, and what does happen is a failed marriage proposal made by a white actor with black face. The same laying bare of the mechanism is at work in, let's see if I can get this, two mulatto figures, both of whom are played by actors, an actor and actress in blackface. This is Lydia Brown, who is the housekeeper and mistress of Mr. Senator Stoneman, who is modeled after Thaddeus Stevens, who was the chief architect of Reconstruction after the end of the war. And the second is, oops, I'm not doing this very well. In fact, I'm not finding this either. I don't think I have it. There it is. There's the second one. This is Simon Lynch, who is a tool of Senator Stoneman, and he goes on to become the Lieutenant General of South Carolina. And that's Lily, the lovely Lillian Gish there. These mulatto figures are both kind of represented as not fully human. Simon Lynch actually dreams here of becoming the head of a black empire. And he's proposing here to Lillian Gish, who, like her future sister-in-law, goes crazy at the thought. You know, she runs wildly around the room, arms flailing, eyes rolling. His intention is to become the head of a black empire with her as his queen. I'm not sure how that works, since she's white and he's half white. The children will not exactly be credible inhabitants of a black empire. And the other one, where is she? One more, there. Lydia is this nightmare figure who dreams of perfect racial equality. Here she is, kind of going nuts at the thought of the mixing of the races and racial equality. These are such striking figures. And they must have seemed like the ultimate threat at the time. And yet, the fact that they're played in blackface inflects them in a certain way. And this is crucial, and it's the key to the approach of the nation, which I'm coming around to. Because what you see here is manifestly, inescapably, white actors playing black people, right? And the fact that they can so easily do so, that they can flip one to the other, suggests a certain principle of reversibility, symmetry, or equality that is actually very unrealistic, but it's crucial to the effects that the movie actually has. And oddly enough, it's also crucial to the message that Dixon, no matter what his intentions were meant to convey. For Dixon, the idea of reversibility or symmetry is kind of a mechanical thinker. It's almost a tick. You can see it at every level of his fiction, from conversations to the plot setup. Of course, the fact that he's dealing with the Civil War, where you have North and South, and black and white, and male and female, and all these binary opposition. What Dixon contributes to this, and what the blackface reaffirms, is that these distinctions might seem to be distinctions between opposing energies, but in fact they're quite reversible. A black person can be white, as in blackface. A white actor can become black, as in blackface. You see how cunning the concept of blackface affects a kind of mixing that the message of the film would seem to deny. And this is reinforced in something that every viewer of the movie must take note of, and which is quite surprising. The argument of the Klansman and the argument of the first half of the Birth of a Nation is that the common view of the Civil War is all wrong. The South is not the evil domain of slavery and hatred, and the North is not the pure, notion of democratic governance and liberty and purity. The facts of the matter are quite different. The argument is made at length that the North was responsible for the slave trade, and the South had slavery foisted upon it. That while voices of freedom and abolition were being heard in the South, profiteers in the North were running the whole show. Abraham Lincoln was a Southern president and cherished by the South, even while he was hated and despised and reviled in the North, and on and on and on. So that what you have in the movie is the consistent argument that the North is guilty of crimes for which the South bears the sole burden, and that the South has virtues that the North had claimed as its only province. So you see that there's a principle of reversibility that is crucial to the argument that the film actually makes. Why is this important? It's for this reason. The chief fear at the end of the war was that the South, as this wasted domain of conquered provinces, would become a kind of guerrilla force, and that they would never accept their reintegration into the nation, that they just become a criminalized, destitute, bitter group of entirely dispossessed and marginalized people. The problem was how to integrate this population back into the nation. And the way that gradually emerged was for the South to be permitted to think well of itself once again. Eventually, actually it started quite early, even like late 1860s, but eventually through the Southern Heritage Society, Southern authors, Southern journalism, public speakers, something called the Lost Cause came into focus. And the Lost Cause became the name of the way that the South could think of itself as an honorable and fully respectable subunit within the nation. In the ideology of the Lost Cause, Southern soldiers were just as distinguished for valor and honor and bravery as the North. their cause was as honorable as was the cause of the North. Slavery was not so bad as the Northern people would have you think. You know, there were good aspects to it. And, strikingly, the South was heartily glad that slavery was abolished, while the North was not necessarily, because it meant loss of income in many ways. But the South, they would insist, never really wanted slavery. It's just what we had to live with. And this was a kind of Southern fetish gathering force over the course of the last half of the 19th century. People began to think of the lost cause and to think of it with pride. You know, our fathers, our grandfathers fought for the lost cause. You have all these statues and monuments going up celebrating the lost cause. It was a way for the South to think well of itself. But it was a Southern thing only until Dixon decided to become the nation's leading racist and the nation's leading advocate for the lost cause. And because Dixon was such an extraordinarily successful public speaker, minister, playwright, novelist, he had a Northern audience as well as a Southern audience. And at that point, 1904, the first decade of the 20th century, the lost cause became accepted as a kind of national principle of sectional reintegration. The North was prepared to grant the Southerners their dreams of the lost cause because this eased Southern reintegration into the nation. The South was unable to think of themselves as an honorable and honored aspect of the nation with its own specificity. As early as the 1840s, John C. Calhoun, a famous Southern politician, was talking about the idea of the nation as applied to the South. And an early instance of what I'll later describe as the Southern embrace of nationhood, Calhoun said that, you know, this is not really a nation, it's a federation of nations. He said this is a much more brilliant and productive idea than a nation. And so even before the Civil War in the South, you had people saying, we are not really an element of the nation, we are a nation. We are a nation within a nation. The phrase, the Southern nation, gathered force throughout the course of the 19th century. And when the lost cause crystallized, this was a way for the nation to embrace the South as part of it, and also for the South to think of itself as a nation within the nation. So you can see that the subject might appear to be race, but race is really what triggers a whole skein of thoughts, a sequence of steps by which the South is able to reintegrate into the nation. Now, how is Griffith's film a part of this? Well, here I would have recourse to Ernest Renan's 1888 essay, What is a Nation?, where he said that, first of all, nations were recent, they were invented, they were made up, they're not given, they're not natural artifacts, and that they represent kind of composites of disparate peoples who are unified by consent through the adoption of a soul or a spiritual principle. What Renan doesn't quite say, but which is definitely true, is that this soul or spiritual principle that identifies a nation is crystallized in a particular story that people tell themselves. You know, a story that people tell themselves that permits them to think of their experience in honorable and noble and interesting and rich ways. And here is where the movie, The Birth of a Nation, which disseminated the lost cause version of the war to a vast population, 2 million people saw this movie in the first couple of years, North and South, played an absolutely essential crystallizing role. No previous film had been seen by as many people or taken as seriously by as many people. And what they were taking when they saw it was a view of the nation as crystallized by this story. If you ask yourself what year the nation was born, any of you might say 1776 or maybe 1787, the Constitution was adopted. If you follow Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, you might think of a new nation consecrated unto liberty is born in 1865. Maybe Thomas Dixon would say the nation was born in 1871 when the Klan took action and stamped out the black threat and reestablished order and civility here. Or you might say that the nation was born with the birth of a nation, when the nation was exposed to this story about its own origins and its own genesis. So it's actually possible to say that we owe to Dixon and to Griffith an immense debt. We owe them the nation. It's a violent, deluded, schismatic, white supremacist nation that we owe them, but we owe them the nation, which, absent this story, which enabled us to unify around a certain common principle, might have just broken apart. Now, this is not the end of this story. I want to return to the point at which I began, when I said that most white liberals, when they think of the birth of a nation, they don't want to see it at all. They want to see it suppressed, banned, ruled out of court. Every time it's scheduled to be shown, there are demonstrations saying you should not show this. Black filmmakers do not, in general, take this stance. There are three that I mentioned. Spike Lee, whose first movie as a film student at NYU, took on the birth of a nation, and whose most recent movie, but one, Black Klansman, actually has footage from the birth of a nation in it. Another is a man whose name is DJ Spooky. He's won a MacArthur Prize. He's actually quite a serious artist, who produced a version of The Birth of a Nation that kind of technologically interferes with it in some interesting ways and cuts it in half, has a new soundtrack. It's called The Rebirth of a Nation. And then the third is called The Birth of a Nation, but it concerns the 1831 uprising by Nat Turner, the Nat Turner Rebellion. So here are three quite recent instances where black filmmakers have not suppressed, they've not deplored, they've not banned, they've taken it as the occasion for another rethinking of the nation. Most provocatively, the New York Times recently has launched a project, as it calls it, the 1619 Project, that argues that the nation was not born in 1776, 1787, 1865, 1950, none of these dates. It was born in 1619. The country's true birth date is 1619, this project says. And this project consists of, well, it's an issue of the New York Times Magazine that I think will have after effects as well. Essays, works of art, photographs, journalism, all manner of stuff. And 1619 is chosen as the country's true birth date because that was the day that the first slave arrived. In other words, even before the Puritans arrived, there were slaves arriving. And the premise of the project is that the country, the United States, was founded on an ideal and a lie. And they thought that if you tell the story beginning in 1619, when the first slave arrives, you can see that the country was never dedicated to unity or liberty or equality or anything like this. The country was dedicated, as it were, to servitude. Strikingly, this is the very same story that D.W. Griffith tells. Griffith begins in 1619. It's not a date, but the first slide of the movie is that the seeds of disunion were planted with the arrival of the first African Americans. They begin their story in the same way. Now, the film seems to boast about the fact that, about what has happened to black people since then, and the 1619 Project deplores that fact, but it is the same story, just told from a very different point of view. They also take some of the same distanced view of the Declaration of Independence with its statement that all men are created equal. The 1619 Project authors would insist that that's a lie, that the signatories to the Declaration never actually believed that all men are created equal. They were quite happy to tolerate slavery. And Dixon would say, well, that all men are created equal, that's obviously a lie, because it's not true. But it's the same distance from the Declaration of Independence. Neither one of them likes the Declaration. Both of them like the Constitution. And I think that one of the reasons that both Southerners and the 1619 authors prefer the Constitution to the Declaration is that the Declaration is very hostile to stories. I mean, if you start out with the premise of absolute equality, that's a kind of pale homogeneity. There are no individuals there. And stories really depend upon having individuals. The Constitution it's dull, it's technocratic, it delineates powers, but it delineates separate powers. And there's a number of sharply edged individuals, the president, the vice president, the Supreme Court, Chief Justice, senators, representatives, on down to that shadowy domain inhabited by what are called, delicately, persons bound to service. So in the Constitution, you don't have a story, but what you have is the essentials of a story, which is you have individuals and differences, maybe some violent and ineradicable differences in individuals. So in this way as well, I think the 1619 Project, which is kind of the vanguard of the pro-black thinking today, actually replicates the essentials of the story of the birth of a nation. And lastly, I think Griffith anticipated and realized in dramatic ways the effect of disseminating a single story to a large population, the nation-building effect of disseminating a single story to a large population. He couldn't have known anything about the way that the internet disseminates stories today, but you can see the same mechanism at work, where you have a group of disparate people, might be geographically very separated, but if they can get a story out there, everybody in that group, which is now not called typically a nation, but a community, can gather around that story and they can acquire a kind of virtual integrity that is nation-like. That is, there is a soul, there is a spiritual principle, there's a composite going on, there's consent. And to that, too, I think we owe that very contemporary form of nation building and community building. That, too, is, I think, directly derivative from the birth of a nation, and that's all I'll say now. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the stimulating paper, which I read, and this presentation, and getting me to finally watch the film, which, for years I've thought I've known what it is, right? And it's one of these films that we can know without having to actually watch it, so it was actually, it was educational to actually be forced to watch it. So, this is not a phrase that you mentioned in your talk just now, but I have the paper that you sent me, and you say sort of towards the end of the introduction about the situation where we stand with these two positions, right? Where it is the greatest film ever made and it's the most reprehensible film ever made. You say thought is frozen and must, it seems, remain so as long as the film is seen solely as an endorsement of white supremacy and racial violence. Yeah. And I thought, since I really have nothing to say about this film specifically, I wanted to pick up on this idea of thought being frozen and its relationship to images, representations, or works of art, depending on how we want to use these phrases. And so, what images freeze thought, so to speak, and what images perhaps might work to unfreeze thought?
I think by that I meant primarily the social conditions in the United States right now are such that thought is frozen, not necessarily by a given image, but when you introduce the subject of race, it's just very difficult to have not a candid discussion, lots of candor. It's very difficult to have a kind of flexible or exploratory or probing discussion about race, because the subject is considered to be moralized from the outset.
Right. No, so I'm sorry if I'm actually just going to play on if you don't mind, I'm going to play on this idea of
I see you're determined to do that.
Thought is frozen. Right. Well, it's I don't mean to create a misunderstanding there. It's just. I see what you mean in the sentence here, but I mean, reflecting on your paper, the film through your paper has. I've been thinking. I'm going to put this in certain terms in relationship to some of the work that I've been working on recently that Ava mentioned that I've recently finished, where some of the ideas that you connect to Renan and the idea of what's necessary for creating a nation, I think can, and as you well know, right, can be traced much further back, whether it's specific to thinking about what's necessary for any kind of, for a political community, maybe not specifically a nation, can be traced back to certain, and the role that images play in that process of creating a community of people who might start off as individually separated but need to somehow come together and have some type of shared wants and shared cares, right? And here I'm thinking specifically of a tradition that one can trace back to Plato in the Laws, where he talks about the necessity for so-called preludes to the law, that if we're going to care about the law, if we're going to care about sharing the law together, we need to be moved in a certain kind of way by works of art. There he has, by using the word prelude, he has music perhaps more in mind, but these images that move us, right, and perhaps moving images are the most powerful, as I think you rightly point out. That in a way, Griffith is here by creating film as we know it, maybe bringing about the type of moving image that Plato and then also and then thinkers since him have sort of known were necessary, even if they couldn't, if they had never seen a Griffith film. And so I suppose I want to offer a kind of distinction, right, between works of art or images that serve to move us in a way to bring it so that we can have the same wants and cares, so that what you're describing is necessary for the creation of a nation, right? And images, right, here in this case of films that, and those are ones that would give us the opportunity to give us what we talk about, a shared story, the story that we tell ourselves as necessary for that, right? And I think you talked about the film as providing that, whether we like that story or not. That one of the powerful things about this is that it provided that story. On the other hand, I heard another side of your talk, and I guess this is where I want to ask you to think about these two things. Is that whereas on the one hand you present the film as doing this work of providing a shared story such that a nation can come about. On the other hand, this is the kind of the Brechtian side of your reading. You point to a number of disjunctions or moments that can be taken as somehow disjunctions that can unsettle a viewer's simple acceptance of the story that's being depicted, right? Whether that's, you discussed explicitly and at length how Blackface does that. I find that when watching the film, I found that a lot of the intertitles create, at least to my ear, and maybe this is also a question of how this might change over at historical moments, right? But at least to me, when watching it, I felt that a lot of the intertitles were making claims that I found to be somehow at odds in conflicted ways with what I had just seen on the screen. And so instead of just reaffirming what I had seen, actually put me in a situation where I needed to think about that disjunction between
I hadn't thought
between the two. And I think it's probably not for nothing, right, that a number of years later, probably after having watched this film and a number of other similar films, Bertolt Brecht came up with the idea of putting placards up on stage to do precisely that in the theater, right? Which is what can happen here. The intertitles are used because of necessity, because they're silent films, but they also can create this possibility of disjunction. And so I want to suggest that there's another kind of work that's not a kind of image that's not just about moving us or sort of freezing our thought, right? But one into, say, a nationalistic feeling, right? But rather one that can unsettle us and therefore make us think and make us question, right? And that if a work And in a sense, in that all stories are incomplete, right? If you can find the incompleteness in a story, then in a sense, any story should be capable of this.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess I want to suggest that some works of art, some representations, by actually introducing these types of techniques that you point out, right, are actually not even trying to hide the artifice, but actually showing the artifice in such ways as to maybe encourage more and more thinking, right? And I think that that's an interesting kind of work that that one does. One would need to ask, this would be a political question, whether such types of works are good for the nation, right, or bad, in the sense that they perhaps distance a person from commitment to the nation in a certain kind of way, but they also might produce a certain kind of thinking that we might, for example, connect to the type of thinking that, say, a liberal education is at least supposed to be engaging in. So we have these two, these two types of image, and what's interesting in your presentation is that I feel like at different times you talk about the birth of the nation as being, in a way, both of them. So I'm curious about that. And just one last thought, right, and then I will shut up. Is that let's take your most sympathetic reading of the film, right, and say that the birth of the nation, regardless of the intentions of Dixon and Griffith, which and let's just take it as an aesthetic work or as an image that we're looking at. Let's give it the most sympathetic reading and say, actually, it is doing this work of disrupting us. It's not such a simple work of just trying to get us to be committed to some form of white supremacy, but actually giving us the opportunities to think critically about it, right? Nevertheless, historically, as we all know, right, after the film was released, right, in actual practice, it led to reinvigoration of the Klan, more actual lynchings, and now one can say well, those people were not good film goers, right? That they went to this film. Among their flaws, they never took classes with Matthias. They didn't know properly how to evaluate film, right? And so, well, we can't blame the film. Well, I don't know. I mean, in a way, this is what I want to ask, right? Like, let's say such works exist, what I'm calling, let's say, critical works of art, or works that inspire thinking exist, and yet, nevertheless, plenty of people can experience those works and see what they want to see, rather than be led to think as the work might at least in some way lead you to. And then what do you do in that type of situation, I guess, is this question I have. Yeah.
Well, I think what you do in that kind of situation depends on who you are, which is the point of your question in the first instance. But let me return to something you said. Is this kind of disruptive or incongruous thinking, is it good for the nation or is it bad for the nation? And I would say it's both for the nation. As Renan said, progress in historical studies is often an inconvenience for the nation, because historical studies will reveal the flaws in the story about the nation that is currently received. It will show that it's not true. And in fact, I think The Birth of a Nation offers itself as historically accurate. That's the point of all these citations from Woodrow Wilson and these other people, historians. They're saying that the story that you were told about the nation was not true. This is the truth. And in this respect, historical studies represent a kind of solvent or an acid working on the nation. But of course, that's good for another kind of nation that is born from the ashes of the old nation that is being destroyed. And that's the way a modern liberal nation, you could say, advances. And if it doesn't expose itself to constant adaptations, it will eventually just kind of ossify and die. We call that that's like an empire. It's not a nation. It's a theocracy, or it's something else other than a nation. But it's interesting to see that the work of corroding the old narrative can go on at many levels. Not only these odd intertitles that suggest that there's a kind of difference between what you're seeing and what you're supposed to be thinking, but also in the Blackface, which shows the kind of odd reversibility, the disturbing to a supremacist reversibility of the races. Because you see the work of nation destroying and nation building going on at the same time. And then, of course, The Birth of a Nation is itself exposed to historical critique. Historians have done this. You know, they say that there is no black lieutenant governor of South Carolina in 1871. It's untrue. And you attack the story of The Birth of a Nation by pointing out its failures of verisimilitude. But any story, as you point out, any story is vulnerable to historical critique, you know, because all stories, being stories, have, you know, flaws of representation built in them. So that would suggest that all nations, like all stories, have this kind of principle of weakness, and it's also a principle of dynamism built into them, and this constant exposure to the future. Yes? Who's in charge of? Okay.
I mean, unless you want me, I mean, you're taking the questions. If you want, I can.
Why don't you do that? Because you can call on people by name, which I can't do except for him. Matthias.
So, yes. Okay. Thank you for this very interesting reading of Birth of a Nation. I very much appreciated that. And just to, as I said yesterday already, I totally agree with the evaluation of that film as being a very important film in terms of film history, masterpiece in filmic storytelling and the evolution of cinematographic language. But I'm a bit more skeptical about your deconstructive interpretation. That's the idea of, you know, the Brechtian almost alienation effect that is created by Blackface and so on. Because the way I understood it is that having white actors doing this blackface was kind of a tradition at that time. So it was not something that Griffith invented to make people aware, oh my God, there's this reversibility effect here. I think that Griffith's idea was, his intention was, and yeah, I know we shouldn't maybe not talk about intention, nevertheless, he wanted to tell a story in the most convincing, straightforward way. That was his great achievement in your filmic storytelling, to have this epic 3-hour story unfolding that we could believe, and not being distracted by alienating effects, Brechtian effects. So I don't think that, although we today have this kind of more sophisticated sensibility, and it might be an interesting exercise to have these deconstructive reading of the film, I don't think that at the core of the film this was somehow meant to make us aware of reversibility and kind of exchangeability of races here. And it could be kind of a dangerous path actually, because if I may just use that logic and look at, because last week we talked about Nazi propaganda films in the film class. You take a Nazi film, an anti-Semitic Nazi film, and look at that, and then you think, okay, so there's a non-Jewish actor playing a Jewish character. Maybe they wanted to make us aware of the reversibility of the characters, and I don't think so. So what I still see in Griffith's masterpiece is a presentation that is kind of racist. And I very much appreciate an understanding of the film and kind of an elaboration that allows us to see something more complex in it. But I think it could be dangerous to try to understand or try to interpret something like alienation effects or Brechtian effects in a film that I think is not there.
Are you done? Well, first I would never say no, it's not dangerous. I would only welcome the danger, because I would see dangers of tying interpretation to what I suppose the intentions of the creators are. I see that as a danger too. And one of the dangers is that it inhibits thought to my speculations about the inner motivations of people that I never knew. So I think there are dangers of both sides. And all you can do is make your case, adduce the kinds of evidence that you see as relevant, and offer it to a skeptical public. And so I respect your skepticism, and I hold to my argument.
Sure.
Yeah.
There's some points of connection with what Matthias just said, but this is just my reaction. I'm sorry, I feel like every time I'm here, you're really provoking me to think today, which is good. So I guess my question, what I would say is, the question that I would want to have as a rejoinder isn't, is it good for the nation? It's, is it a good nation, right? Or, I mean, like, and having, you know, also taught a number of classes, like global citizenship a number of times, in which, you know, we're talking about nationalism and ethnocultural nationalism versus a kind of constitutionally based vision of nationalism. I think that one thing, you know, that I think is a positive for me from the way that you've been describing this film, which I have to admit I did not sit through last night, in part because
It only takes 3 hours and 9 minutes. So.
we had another guest that we were hosting that, you know, I was partially responsible for yesterday. But what I hear and see from this is, like, in fact, I also was thinking of Nazi propaganda films in a way, but let me try to clarify. Being a US citizen, I feel like, in a way, it's good to be forced to see how awful this nation that was conjured into being by Birth of a Nation is, right? Because we, you know, when you're talking about this golden or the lost cause or
Lost cause.
that this is what reminds me a little bit of, you know, narratives that came up at the end of World War II in Germany, right? It's like, we can say, okay, people told themselves narratives so that they didn't have to feel bad about things, but that doesn't mean, I understand that as an individual survival strategy, but that, and as a historical context, right? But that doesn't mean that I want to be a member of a nation that is founded in these kinds of historical, you know, misrememberings and historical atrocity and this kind of myth that legitimizes horrible racial violence, right? So all this to say, I mean, and I think this is what you're speaking to when you then bring up examples like the 1619 Project and other Black filmmakers who are trying to go back and revive this, but to force Americans, US Americans, to say, like, look, this is what our country is based, this is what our nationhood is based in. And is that a good nation? To which I could only say no, right? And so I'm not exactly sure what my question is, but I'm just also responding to you know, to Matthias and this notion of like, what do we do? And you know, what you've described, like, what do we do with a film like this today? We don't ban, you know, if you don't want to ban it and say it's dangerous in a way that we're not willing to accept, like, how do we engage with it?
Well,
So just to clarify, I didn't ask to ban the film. No, on the contrary. So that was not my point. No, we should watch this film. Like, we should also watch Nazi propaganda films. They should be available. People should watch this. Doesn't have to ignore this stuff, right? So just.
I take your question as kind of the indicator of a lot of deep and agitated thought. It doesn't really cohere into maybe a question that I can answer, but I see the disquiet that you're indicating. You use the word misremember, and I would like to ask in return whether you could ever accurately render the whole truth and nothing but the truth in the form of a story. You know, I think that what you would have is a welter of details, unorganized, and so all remembering, you could say, is an act of misremembering, skewed in some direction or other. But let me bring up something that I didn't lay emphasis on in my talk about why Black filmmakers, and this involves sheer speculation on my part, might bring up The Birth of a Nation when white, progressive liberal whites would rather see the film just go away. And I think one reason is that not only does it kind of give them a set of instructions on how they might birth a nation or rebirth a nation, but it also, the film tells, without any evasion or any apology, the essential story that they might tell about Black experience in the United States, which is, we were brought here as slaves, we were kept that way for hundreds of years, we were told we were liberated. When we tried to exercise the rights they said we had, we were attacked and murdered, and then the courts and society at large backed up the murderers, and that's our story. And that's the story the Birth of a Nation tells. In other words, they might see it as the truth. And then say, we don't want to be involved in a nation like that. We want to tell a new story about the nation. That's what we're doing. You see how complicated it is. You know, the story that people are attacking for wild unreality, substituting prejudice for fact and everything, might be seen at another level by a black person who I'm creating for my own purposes as the essential truth, you know, the pure truth, in a way that whites would generally deny. And they say, oh no, that's not the way it is at all. But one might say, oh yeah, well it is. It's very difficult to come up with the one story that tells a satisfying truth that you would choose, if you had it in your power to choose, to adapt as the story of your nation, or even as the story of yourself for that matter.
Yes, I have a question maybe that also goes into a little bit of like methodology, almost, kind of. Because I think at one point in the talk or in your presentation, you mentioned this idea that the audience would have known, right? Like this question of knowing as an audience. And I think, to me, it almost introduces this question of also, to what extent can we accredit an audience as being critical, as being self-referential, and hopefully I also assume that I at least try to take that position, that we want to give people the agency of self-reflection and critical thinking. But I'm wondering how you also went about that in this time that was presumably also very obviously racially charged, and on the one hand you say, you know, there are these narratives of this is what was happening at the time and this is what's happening in the film, and then I'm wondering how we then treat, you know, the cinema goers, and how you perhaps try to picture these people then in your research.
You know, if there had been any wobble in that case, I don't think I would have made it, because there's no methodology that could vindicate that move. It's just that I can't imagine that there was any moderately literate, sophisticated, serious person who would not have known that whatever racial mixing was going on was the work of white men on black women. As I said, there were thousands of pages of congressional testimony. They've been put online but not searchable. You have to go page by page. But the bottom line is that hundreds and hundreds of cases of white rape and white rape and murder were uncovered, none of them punished, and not a single case in South Carolina in 1871 of a black man raping a white woman. And I think that, I mean, the tendency is so extreme that there would have been, for a moderately sophisticated, intelligent person, there would have been no escaping this. If it had been more muddled or ambiguous, I never would have made that statement. But given the facts as I can determine them.
If I may just respond, I think I just use that as an instance to showcase that you were talking about the audience as being a part of, or like how you were treating the audience as thinking about certain things in a certain way, but maybe more broadly perhaps, also just thinking of communal narratives perhaps of race, and then maybe upholding those as a truth, and then maybe this goes to Matthias and Carrie's comment about, can we then also expect like a level of like Brechtian critical thinking kind of arising in that, when you may have also then racialized communal
I would say probably not at the conscious level, but one of my intentions is to bring this up and to make it inescapable. And you can test that on your own responses or not, but a lot of criticism proceeds by making explicit what goes on in a kind of murky, unorganized way in the back of your mind, and that's what I'm trying to do here.
Good evening. My question may sound a bit controversial, but when we hear the word racist or race, we usually imagine a white person, a white human, as a racist.
Yeah.
But why the racist term doesn't apply more on other groups of special minorities or people of color? Usually I heard racist, okay, white was racist, white is racist, but when I see other people from other backgrounds, they're being offensive or acting in a way racist towards whites. I don't see they're being labeled as racist, and why is that? And how it has been constructed that whites are related much more to race and races?
That's an excellent question, and if you travel the world, you notice that many cultures, especially the more isolated cultures like Japan, are explicitly racist. Other countries are legally racist. But in the United States, racism, racial difference, the perception and notation of racial difference took such dramatic and shameful forms that racist thinking is thought to be evil on the face of it. And the situation has become so kind of aggravated in the United States right now that, as I mentioned in the paper but didn't mention in the talk, the term racist has kind of swallowed up its nearest synonyms, so that the thinking of W.E.B. Du Bois, a famous African-American intellectual at the beginning of the 20th century, would now be considered racist. He wrote an article called The Conservation of Races, one of his most important articles, in fact. And he talked about the special mission or the special message that each race brought to the world. Today, that would be considered very unacceptable. So that it's very difficult to talk about race in America without sliding immediately into racism. And when you're in racism, then you're in the heart of evil. That's one thing that I meant by saying that thought is frozen. Once you're in the heart of evil, you just can't get out of it.
Yeah.
Okay, hi. Going a little back to the notion of audience, and we were talking about contemporaneous audience, and I'd like to talk now about contemporary audience. And you were talking about how, again, we see different interpretations from, in particular, contemporary African-American directors, such as Spike Lee and BlacKkKlansman, but they're showing it in a particular lens. They're showing it in a critical lens, these films. In the United States, when we're talking about nationhood and representation, it's still an extremely divisive issue. These definitions are not so reliant on, let's say, people like us sitting in the audience with this intellectual mind and grasp to understand that these sources have a contemporaneous mind, contemporaneous attitude towards religions, races, etc. But that there are other people in the United States, even from our earliest readings in the popular sovereignty class, that have very different views on what it really means to be representative, in particular due to geopolitical differences. So my main question and my main point is, how can contemporary audiences interpret this film when there's still a large sect of American populace that goes on the streets to, let's say, Charleston, Virginia, cries blood and soil, and David Duke is still speaking out publicly towards condemning, having equality. So I do see, I'm not saying we need to banish the film, but I'm saying that under your argument, there's this precipice to me that we all need to be a well-educated person to witness these things, and to a well-educated person and a political person to think about it, but not just a political person, but you need to be on, there are different interpretations on the extremes that will inevitably lead to different definitions and to things that are still continuing to a worldwide nationalist changes we're seeing under the current incumbent executive order.
Yeah. Well, my basic position is that that social progress requires fresh thinking, often requires fresh thinking about the past. And the past must be faced, which means it must be witnessed, absorbed, taken in fully, without evasion or embarrassment. Part of my project here is to bring up this aspect of the past in all of its complexity, and even perhaps some small progressive seeds that might be buried in an artifact that we would consider, that we would basically condemn for its regressive attitudes. And if you can discover some little green shoots appearing between the slabs of concrete in the ideology of this film, maybe it would give you some more productive attitude towards the past, which might lead to some greater optimism towards the future.
Can I just respond?
Yeah.
So the history inevitably parallels each other, unfortunately, and we're dealing with a certain sect of a population, the same types of sects that the United States is dealing with in the setting that are saying very similar things without just saying outright Aryan race for all. So I'm a little, I mean, again, while we can have these conversations and watch this film with a certain lens, I feel like this film does have some susceptibility to people that still hang, let's say, Confederate flags outside their porch.
When you have something as unavoidable and unforgettable and something that you have to face as the history of slavery in America, and something like this film, forgetting is not possible. So recontextualization and maybe a critical reevaluation and looking at these kind of primary sources again through different ways and putting them back into the discourse could be an alternative in a kind of more conscious form of nation building in which we participate, as opposed to things that we're kind of forced to leave behind in order to continue. And yeah, if that's something that you see as a project that is desirable, and if that's kind of along the lines of what you're thinking about.
Absolutely, I would never have put it to myself like that, but I'm happy to accept the characterization. Every act of memory is also an act of misremembering and an act of forgetting. I forget what wise person said that. It must have been somebody. And so this film, which remembers some aspect of the past, is also, of course, a misremembering. And what I would insist on is that it should not be altogether obliterated from memory. It should be seen as a memory and a misremembering, and subject to historical critique and critical reflection, because that's the way that social thought makes progress, I think, through continual re-exam, is very humanistic, continual re-examination of the artifacts of the past. And so I accept that characterization completely.
Well, I mean, following up on this, and I want to pick up also Carrie's point, which seemed to me weightier than what you responded to. When I said that I suffered through the film, and you asked why was it painful, and I was trying to figure out why was it painful. Can Carrie help me answer that question? It was embarrassing, right? I'm not American, so I don't have an immediate identification, but because the film is so powerful, I did have an identification, and I was forced to identify with the whites somehow, or not. But the identification, the painful, the embarrassment is precisely that you don't want to be that, right? You're forced into a line of division, and whichever line you are, you don't want to be. The blacks are represented unattractively or shamefully. The whites, who are supposed to be the heroes of the story from our point of view, are completely unacceptable. So it's an experience, right? That it says, I don't want to be part of that. And it's precisely what you're saying. We need to retain that kind of easy desire to let us dissociate ourselves from the past and say the past is gone, forget it, bury it. Do something else, and you say no, that shouldn't be allowed. That's not a fair move. But there was another level of parallel, or another level to Carrie's question that I don't think you picked up, and that's not only that this is not a good nation, but there shouldn't be nations. If that's what it takes, right? And what it takes is that in order to create trust, and in order to reunite, we actually have to have a scapegoat. We need to do it at someone else's expense. To regain pride for the past, right? To be able to identify and say, okay, it's okay what we did. It's a lost cause, but it was a noble one. That's happening at someone else's expense, right? And so what the discomfiture comes here is that that we can only be together if someone else is thrusted out of the social contract, so to say. And that's what's really, that's the fundamental issue. Why do we need nations?
That wasn't the way I thought you were going to end that question.
You can end it.
Because I thought I could answer the question until that moment when. But what Renan says is that nations are fusions affected by various means. They involve consent, That is, the various disparate elements of a population consent to be in this nation, but there is a fusion. And typically, that fusion is affected by violence. And so every nation has a founding violence that it has to forget. That's why it's good for us to forget it, because if we keep remembering it, then we don't want to be in this nation, right? You know, who wants to be in this violent, oppressive, schismatic nation? So you have to forget it in order to be a nation. And in foregrounding the first seeds of disunion, it's the first thing you see. The first seeds of disunion were planted by the importation of black people. Griffith is essentially telling us that this nation is never going to be a nation without that violence, because these people will never be part of the Union. I mean, he thought it's because they're just uncivilizable. Other people would say it's because we refuse to recognize their humanity. But there's an alarmingly growing number of people who are saying this is not really a nation, and that the racial issue is what keeps us from being a nation. I will not recommend that we all just forget about it, because with forgetting goes forgiveness, and that's, you want some other reckoning than forgiveness. But to speak to the first part of your question, something I didn't dwell on, about how you identified with the white people, despite your wishes. I spoke with a very distinguished historian, the most distinguished African-American historian in the second half of the 20th century, John Hope Franklin. He was a friend. And he told me of seeing The Birth of a Nation in a mixed audience. And at the moment when the Klan charged with their regalia, their robes, and their horses, and the camera was backing up, and the horses were charging right at you, everybody in the audience, black and white, stood to cheer. And there was some people must have felt a little embarrassed about that at the end of the movie when they realized what they'd done. There's a book written by The Birth of a Nation that just kind of compiles every available known fact into it. One of the things it does is it tracks a whole century-long history of black sympathy for the film. The very NAACP workers who were making arguments in courts of law against the film, when they saw the film, reported being swept away by it. And there's a whole history of people, and the guy collects their responses. Some people like the very affectionate portrayal of the slaves who were faithful to their former owners. Other people liked the singing and the dancing that the black people were shown doing, the happy slaves. Other people liked the thought that there was a time when black people could actually hold legislative office. They could actually not only vote, but elect black people. Other people liked the fact that black people were going out after white people and killing them, which is also a part of the movie. There's no end of reasons why a black person might like this film. It seems almost inconceivable to us, but apparently not to them. As it were, everybody's kind of put in a certain position by the film in one way or another, and there are many different angles or hooks that you can grab onto the film with, not all voluntarily, or not all things that you would wish. Matthias?
Yeah, to relate exactly what you just said to what Hannah said or asked before about the contemporary audience and how self-reflective they might be to understand that, we talked about the rape that is just not shown, but the people should know, of course, at the time that rape was committed mostly by white men against...
Almost entirely.
Yes, entirely. So, but you see, you're describing the emotional power of the film.
Yes.
So I wonder how again, this is an argument maybe against this Brechtian interpretation. How can we distance ourselves and start to think about the complexity that you suggested in the film, that I very appreciate, I just want to stress this again, that as you've just described, there's this emotional power, which is usually part of motion pictures, right? That for at least the time when we consume a film seems to stop our brains to function, or the part of our brain, which is wonderful because this is what cinema is all about. But wouldn't that be another argument to say we have to be careful about interpretations that suggest that there's more complexity that allows us to see also some kind of redeeming, as it were, redeeming aspects to that film? Because we are just, everybody cheers when the Ku Klux Klan is right.
What I think we should be careful of is just praising the term in technical terms as a work of cinematic genius and ignoring the moral dimension to it. That, I think, is that's reprehensible. That's a form of ignorance. But just as limiting is an approach that simply takes the moral character of the film without taking into account other possibilities that might be kind of beyond the scope of the creator's intentions, but still definitely represented there, according to me.
Yeah, it was just a comment to reply to that. Just, I understand what you're saying, but I feel it just fails to separate the intentions of the creators from what this paper and this or this lecture and this idea is trying to do with the film, which is precisely to praise not the intentions of the film, but our critical reception and our ability to understand the film differently and to still learn from it in a different way, and in a way I think it's two different things somehow.
We're kind of over time, but I want to press you with this one question that you ignored, which is, I mean, when you were saying about the black filmmakers, you said one thing they might take from the film is a set of instructions of how to rebirth a nation.
Yes.
But then you said a nation is inevitably based on violence and on humiliating others. So my question is, why should we want, and I think you're partly in that project, you're in the project of rebirthing your nation. Your nation is in trouble, right? You say it's social, right?
I'm starting in Berlin.
It's a good place. As good as any. Right? There is social disunion, the racial question is pressing forward, and people are at a loss how to recreate solidarity, and you're saying, well, let's revisit this film and think about solidarity. And I think what we find in this film as the basis of social and national solidarity is not pretty. Right? So the question is, why should we want to rebirth nations and not, be progressive and say, okay, it's time to think of something new.
That's a great question, and I'm actually glad that I didn't get out of here without having to answer it, because I think that the question now confronting the nation is not the dominance of polarity. It's not the crimes or flaws or high crimes and misdemeanors of the Trump administration alone. I think the Trump administration presents the country with the greatest threat since the Civil War. Because what we're talking about is threats to the Constitution, to the rule of law, to the idea of the nation. That's the issue raised by his presidency. And we're not getting a kind of unifying answer out of this process. We're getting like 45 to 45, or somewhere in the disorderly, ambiguous middle. But that's the question that we now confront: whether this is a nation, or whether we're going to become Yugoslavia. There have always been secessionist movements: Alaska, Texas. Sarah Palin's husband was part of an Alaska independence movement. Texas has had separatist movements on the ballot, and Trump enlists a different kind of nation, but it definitely sees itself as apart from the elite nation, the dominant coastal, culturally sophisticated nation. So the question we face right now is, do we have a nation here? It's nothing less than that.
Yeah, but we also, part of the question is, why should we want one?
Yeah. Why should we want one if it's going to be, if the template that we have is this kind
Or are
of
these the choices? Is this a necessity? Is this an inevitability? Is there no just-er order that can be brought out of the current situation? Or are we condemned just to reproduce in ever more tragic and novel forms the injustices of the past? And I don't see a set of nations or a federation of nations like John C. Calhoun saw as a good thing or as emerging out of the present moment. I see, partly because it's not geographically discrete areas of the country that are at war with each other. It's kind of aspects of the population or dimensions of.
But just to, and we're kind of out of time, but I think that I think that the challenge here is not that we should shift from one nation to multiple nations, but rather rethink whether whether the nation is the right form of political organization at all, right? Not that we should shift to, so it's not, I don't take this
No.
challenge to be a challenge that secession should be the answer. So I don't know, but I don't, so do you, I don't,
I don't have another idea. I pointed the secession movements only as indications of dissatisfaction with the nation, not of dissatisfaction with the idea of nationhood. Although that's obviously the further turn of the screw, isn't it? And who in the world has gone beyond? I mean, I guess Europe is an expression of dissatisfaction with some of the limitations of nationhood, and Renan explicitly imagined that. He envisioned a pan-national European community. What he didn't envision, which is what we now see, were cyclonic eruptions of local self-assertion that called the nation into question. All he saw was this ever greater amalgamation of nations. Karen, you had your hand up earlier, though. Was that you?
Yeah.
Did you want, yeah.
Oh no, it's just in relation to what the questions before about whether the nation was desirable, and I guess the nation, if imperfect, at least it points to a possibility of like a larger possibility for democracy, which we seem to value, as opposed to just further and further fragmentation and oppression from kind of elites that are not necessarily easy to represent, and that are not interested in the idea of a demos, or like a group that wants to assert a state for itself because it believes in equality. So I guess that would be a value for the nation, just if imperfect. It's especially in the case of America, which is, geographically, if that were viable, it seems like a worthy project. I come from a nation that isn't at the moment, and it seems like something to aspire to, even if there's something better lying ahead, right? I don't know.
Well, on this optimistic note,